Hi, everybody. It's Joe Cioffi on this Sunday after that fantastic Giants game. Oh, my. But we'll lay that aside and look ahead to what the weather world is going to bring us. Looks like we're going to see changes in the overall pattern going forward. Weather models were fairly consistent today in the broad scheme of things, although, as always, they're going to differ on the specifics. We're going to see a gradual chill down in the east. It's probably going to take much of the next 7 days to play out. But after Monday, which will be the last day of temperatures back up near 70 for a while, don't want to say for a long while because you never know when the pattern could flip back. But it does look like we're going to get certainly back down close to average. And then as we go into next weekend, probably much below average, given what is going to be going on in the upper atmosphere. It looks like the models have been kind of adjusting over the last couple of days with how this plays out. Rather than getting one shot and done, it looks like the most important shot will be coming in for next weekend. And it might be setting us up for the potential for some storminess late next week and early next week. A lot of variables, of course, at this stage of the game. But we're going to take a look at what the models have in store, and we'll talk some more when we're done. So just hang on 1 second. Well, it's a fairly busy weather day around the country with a weather front that's coming through the east. You don't see this too often in November, but we actually have tornado watches up in the area in yellow that you see from southeastern Missouri across south central Illinois through a good chunk of Indiana, except the far north and the far south, into Ohio, and then flash flood watches up as well going into western New York, and even up into parts of north central New York where they've had quite a bit of rain over the last 5 days. In the west, we still have winter weather advisories in a few patchy areas of winter storm warnings up in western Washington, northern Idaho, on into the western part of Montana, northwestern Wyoming. Some scattered winter storm warnings in parts of Colorado, and also down into the interior here of southern Oregon, and some winter weather advisories up into Northern California on up into central Washington. So the west getting some weather, and parts of the east as well. We're going to take a look at the western satellite view, and we still have this swirl you see of clouds dropping southward toward the coast of Washington as low pressure drops south, and cold air still kind of pinned west of the mountains into the northwest. And some of that cold air seeping down into Oregon and Northern California. You can see the clouds are actually pushing southward into Northern California. And then, of course, in the east, we've got this weather front, this cold front combination, the warm front moving through the northeast, or at least trying to move through into the northeast, while the cold front approaches from the west with some showers and storms. And the radar, here's the area that's producing some heavy thunderstorms in a few places. You could see in the reds, especially back through Illinois, there seems to be some very heavy thunderstorms there. And as we look into the northeast, we have some rain moving through upstate New York, some rain off the coast of Long Island and southern New England. And out in the west, we've got some areas of rain and snow coming inland into Washington, some snow into eastern Washington, northern Idaho, into Montana, also into parts of southern Idaho, northern Utah, getting some scattered precipitation, and even on up into northern Colorado, into parts of Nebraska. So no major storms here at play, but we do have weather going on, obviously. And we're going to take a look at the upper air pattern going forward, because the weather pattern is evolving in a rather interesting way. You have this trough that's still out in the west, and a bit of ridging here in the eastern part of the United States with that ridge in eastern Canada. Cold air still remains fairly trapped up in Canada, although again some of it is bleeding down into the northwestern part of the United States. Well, I think what we're seeing here is a gradual normalization of the jet stream pattern across the United States. And this is going to start introducing colder air, certainly bringing things back down to normal in the east. And I think we're going to see a shot of some fairly cold air as we go into next weekend. And there's a trough that's swinging through eastern Canada. Now, the cold air, the trough isn't especially deep, but there is a big surface high that's going to be building down. So there might be a fairly large area of low-level cold air that's going to penetrate the eastern states and into the mid-Atlantic. The question is whether that is going to be followed by some kind of storm system going into next weekend. And you can see there's a shortwave trough into the northern Rockies. You've got a trough off the west coast now, and you've got some ridging out in the Atlantic trying to ridge up toward Greenland, and another ridge that's trying to build up toward Alaska. So what this eventually evolves into is a trough in the east early next week, Sunday, Monday. And you can see it here. It's a fairly sharp shortwave trough. When I say a shortwave trough, it's really in terms of the distance. A long wave trough would run, from Canada all the way south. In this case, it's just kind of a piece that's swinging eastward and maintaining some identity here as it swings on through. And you can see that a tight little cutoff low forms and gets wrapped up off the coast of southeastern New England as we move into Monday night and Tuesday. Another trough is approaching the west at that point, and you can see it here in the Gulf of Alaska, extending southward to just off the west coast. And when we look at the upper air, again, going forward, it doesn't look especially warm in the east. In fact, it actually looks rather chilly with the jet stream. If this is correct, and I don't know that it is, because again, we're going into the long range, but you see a lot of high pressure building up across the polar regions. So that is actually going to be displacing the jet far south of normal. And if that's the case, we are going to see cold air come into the east, and cold air also coming in into the northern Rockies out of a flow like this. Whenever you have high pressure building up in the northern latitudes, you displace the cold air further south. There is some semblance of ridging building back across Greenland. So a little bit of, it's not exactly blocking, but it does give a signature that you get when you want to see cold air get pushed further and further south. And in fact, when we look at the temperature anomalies, you can see where the below normals are later in the period in the east, and also again starting to come into the northwest and in the northern Rockies, areas above normal in between. But this is going to be interesting to see how this all plays out going forward in the next couple of weeks. So why don't we take a look at what this means with respect to actual weather, and we'll show you the U.S. here. So here's our front in the east that comes through now on Monday. We're looking at that front approaching the coast. You've got some showers with that. The front's going to weaken a little bit, so the shower area will shrink a bit, but there still should be some showers coming through later Monday morning, Monday afternoon into the northeast. Meanwhile, here's that beginnings of that big high that's going to be a factor down the road. You have easterly winds across the northern Rockies, so that causes some snow to develop. Weather calms down along the west coast. And part of that, so you can see the cold, how it turns just colder as we go through the week. Nothing crazy on this first shot, but it's later in the week you start to get this big high that comes down into Montana and then gradually builds into the northeast for next weekend. Now this may set up with that shortwave trough. You can see how the GFS handles it. It's got a low in northern Missouri that it tracks over to Lake Erie, and then a secondary low starts to form off North Carolina. Now, I don't know if this is going to play out this way. The GFS kind of really went nuts with this for next weekend with a nor'easter-looking system here going into early next week, and some snows up in northern New England and upstate New York, especially in elevation-driven areas. Here's a storm that's coming into the west early next week. So not this week that starts today, but a week from today. So we're talking, next Monday, fairly big. It looks like a powerhouse starts to go into the northwest with rain and snow. The system in the east pulls out, and then it's cold and dry behind it. The European today has the same kind of idea. We'll show you here. Here's that big high on the European for next weekend. So this is a high like this with a strong low sitting up in near Newfoundland. You get a fairly decent shot here of low-level cold air that gets drawn all the way down into the Carolinas if this is correct. And eventually this winds up also producing a low, although the European kind of does it in a different way. You know, it's got lower pressure that it moves over into the western lakes, and then a low off the southeast coast, inverted trough along the east coast, and then it develops a low, not as deep as the GFS, but it does have the same type of upper air signature, but not quite as deep, with a low southeast of Cape Cod by Tuesday. So this would be, you know, a rain event, and then this is only going out to 10 days. So I think the models are pretty much in sync here as far as where we're going with all this. Why don't we look at the GFS in terms of what to expect for snow over the next 10 days. And again, let's take this with a huge grain of salt, okay? But just to give you an idea where the possibilities for snow, of course, continuing up in the northwestern part. Most of this is going to come early in the game, and then when that powerhouse comes in, they'll get more. And then we have some snows up in parts of the upper Great Lakes, the western part of the Great Lakes especially, and back through Minnesota. And also, you know, if the GFS is right with that kind of a deep low, then you might be talking about significant snows for upstate New York and parts of western New England, if that's correct. The European, I would just point out, is far, you know, less bullish with the snow in the northeast for next weekend, if only or early the following week, if only because of the fact that it has a less deep system. So we'll have to just kind of rectify whether that is going to be the case or not. And, you know, just for laughs, the Canadian model, which yesterday had some, you know, low along the coast with some ridiculous big snows along coastal areas, you know, has a wave around midweek that gets close. The other models have it, but it has it much further suppressed. But here comes the cold air for Friday into Saturday. It has the high further south, and then it has a weaker system coming in for Sunday, Monday. And of course, the Canadian loves to spin up tropical lows, so I'm guessing that that's what that is down off the Bahamas. But, you know, I really don't hold much value to what the Canadian does. But the model, I guess the value that we can get out of this is the fact that in terms of the upper air from all the models, they all seem to have something to look for. But you notice that the Canadian has just basically a weak trough, a weakening trough moving east that you could barely find by Monday morning. So here's the upper air on the Canadian. Here's the upper air on the GFS. You see the difference here, this sharp shortwave trough. And then the European sort of splits the difference. It has it there, and it doesn't quite have it as strong as the GFS does. So here's the European model. The GFS at this point already has that upper low, that surface low, and long gone southeast of Nova Scotia. Quick look. Why don't we look at the Canadian Maritimes? We haven't done that in a while. And let's go to southeastern Canada. See what that has to say for us. And, you know, if the GFS is right with this system, of course, we're going to have some pretty cold air. Let me just roll it back. So that weather front moves through the Canadian Maritimes, dry air for the middle and latter part of the week. And then, you know, it has some kind of, you know, a front with that next big high getting ready to build in. So some rain and snow with that, not a whole lot. And then here comes that supposed nor'easter, which brings some significant snows and a pretty big low into Newfoundland. This is for Monday and Tuesday of next week. And in terms of the snowfall, the total snowfall, if that's correct, you can see some pretty hefty amounts. And most of this is going to be produced by that nor'easter. Again, take this with a huge, huge landmine full of salt here, because of how these models are with these things. And with respect to Europe, here's the European snowfall forecast with some snow up in the Highlands in Scotland, Norway and Sweden, of course, and then going into Eastern Europe, some snow forecast over the next 10 days, an expanding area over parts of southern Germany and Poland, on up into Switzerland, of course, and the Italian Alps, continuing along the inland shores of the Adriatic, and back over into western France and northern Spain. And in terms of what it has as far as surface weather is concerned, starting right now where we have this low in the Mediterranean Sea, fairly intense that weekends. Across the British Isles, you can see some patchy showers come in from time to time, no big storms going in through the next 7 days. Actually, it has it pretty quiet there from that standpoint with a big high building in as we go through the latter part of the period. Storm in Eastern Europe with the snows that are being forecast for parts of southern Germany and western France. This just, again, now we're getting into the squirrel territory, which is out over the 10-day period. So, very interesting, trying to pay more attention to what goes on. Here's for you snow lovers in England, I don't know why it's doing this, but it looks like it has some cold air funneling down from the Arctic region late in the period, and you actually have some snow being shown for parts of England and Ireland here. This is going now, we're talking about November 20th and 21st. So I guarantee you when we look at this again, it's going to be a whole lot different. So here's a last look at the national radar as you take a look at some of the weather. All right, so we're back here, and let me just outline a couple of things. In terms of the overall scheme of things across North America, one of the big differences between where we are now and where we were at this time last year, and I put a link up in the chat if you want to check it out. I wrote about it this morning. The cold air, Canada is in a totally different position this year. Last year, Canada through the fall was very warm with much above normal temperatures throughout all of the autumn, and the snow cover was far less. The snow cover in Canada now extends much further south than it did last year, and it actually extends into the continental United States, which is something that was not the case in 2016. So that's one big difference. The other is that it has actually been colder across much of Canada throughout this fall, not everywhere, but in where it counts. And we're gradually seeing cold air build up there. So that is going to be one of the primary drivers. Now, it doesn't necessarily translate into a cold, colder than normal temperatures immediately, or for that matter, it may not even translate for cold air for long periods of time, but it's certainly not a negative. And it would argue that at the very least that we're going to see the winter revert back to something resembling normal as we approach it and get into it. Certainly the weather across the eastern part of the United States has been incredibly warm for this first half of autumn. We're well, actually, if we count it from the actual calendar months, September, October, November being autumn months, we're already 2/3 of the way through. And now we're in the last month of it. So, the fact that this ridge in the east is finally breaking down is a sign that, the pattern is at least reverting back to some semblance of normalcy. Now, whether that winds up translating into some early snowfalls for some places, or at least snowfalls arriving on time as far as climatology is concerned, is, again, going to be a matter for the short range, which we will figure this out. Let's see, Lidl Griffith, feel like the models really need to be taken with a grain of salt the next few weeks. Lidl, the models have to be taken with a grain of salt 365 days a year, not just in the next few weeks in terms of specifics. I think in terms of the general trend, the models are fairly clear on what is going to happen. So remember also, this is the early part of November, okay? So it's not mid or late December we're talking here. It's the early part of November. So averages in many locations are still, warm compared to, 5 weeks from now. Those normals drop a degree or so every 3 days, and certainly the end of the month is far colder than the beginning. But we're not, we're still at the beginning of November. If early snows are going to occur in some places, not so much in the inland area, areas in the interior in upstate New York and in northern New England, for example. But if you're going to be talking about snows in areas further south than that, you're going to have setups that are rather perfect, okay, or close to perfect. You're going to have enough cold air. You're going to have a fairly strong system aloft to kind of generate some more cold air. And you got to have all the track the right way. The ocean is very warm still. There's a lot. A lot stands against all of early snows for coastal areas. But I think for interior areas and the Great Lakes, interior Northeast, you'll probably if this setup holds that the models are showing, I think a week from today we'll probably be talking about some snows for some areas, and the skiers will probably early season skiers maybe will get an early cheap thrill out of this. We'll see. Also, from the standpoint of forecasting, trying to figure that first one of the season is probably the toughest one to forecast because of the fact that it is the first one, and there's a natural tendency for you to look at everything that could go against it. So that is going to be a challenge for me, certainly. And early season snowfalls are certainly not impossible. Okay, they again, the setups have to be correct, but they can happen. And we had actually a couple of years ago, I think back in either 13, 14, or 14, 15, one of those years, there was a Thanksgiving snowstorm for the areas north and west of I-81, and north of I-84 in the interior Northeast. So it does happen. Let's see. I just want to check on some more any of your questions peppered out in the chat here. So just give me a second. I did put up. We did cover those of you maybe joined late. If you are from the Canadian Maritimes, I did do a little look at your weather, and also if you're in Europe, if you're watching from the UK, from Ireland, and from Europe, I did show the European, so you might want to go back after this and just take a look at it. And yeah, the Giants were absolutely god awful. If you're watching from Long Island, I will be doing my next in a series of library chats. So Wednesday night, I'll be at the Middle Country Library in Selden off Middle Country Road, which is about halfway out on Long Island, northeast of Islip. Not too difficult to get to. At 7 o'clock, that's on Wednesday, the 8th of November, and you can get more information on that from my Facebook page, meteorologist Joe Cioffi. Next Sunday, I will be in the North Babylon Library on Long Island at 2 p.m., and I'll put up some information on that in the next day or so. And I also put a link up to my Joe Stradamus store, so if you're starting your Christmas shopping early and you'd like to get somebody anything from a mug to a shower curtain with I created some shower curtains, and there's also some Angry Ben merchandise on there too, so you might want to give that a look, and no obligation, obviously. Delvin, I know you want snow for Boston and Cape Cod and Nantucket. You know how tough it is at any time of year for Cape Cod and Nantucket to get snow. You almost have to wait till February in most years. But on the other hand, for Boston and in the interior, you never know. Something might come a bit earlier. Most of the 5 to 10 years, Box 503, 5 to 10 years have seen above average snowfall in the Northeast, so the averages might catch up. Box 505, at some point, I think you certainly make a valid point. There's nothing that says it can't be cold and dry. There's nothing that says it can't be cold and dry until the storms arrive and then it warms up and rains. Okay, so you really can't. You really can't just bank on the fact that the pattern turning colder is going to be a snow producer, because it might not be. If you don't have the right setups going on, there's other ways. I can remember many winters when I was young, months where we were very cold, well below average, and really didn't get a lot of snow out of it because the storm setups were all wrong. And I've certainly seen it many times to be sub-zero and then warm up and rain and not see a flake or an ice pellet. Raymond, is the Canadian model becoming the NAM is useless? I don't know that I would call the NAM useless. I think the NAM has its value, and at some points, it does hit home runs. I think it did a very good job with a couple of the snowstorms last year. I think it also did a very good job, a fantastic job with the blizzard of the January 2016 blizzard in the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Northeast. So I wouldn't knock it completely. The Canadian, on the other hand, just seems to be, just crazy sometimes. It just does things predictably wrong, spinning up low, every low to a hurricane in the summer and fall, and in the wintertime it does like to make snowstorms at will, but so does the GFS, and occasionally so does the European. So one of the things I just want to point out, by the way, is the fact that I've noticed in the last couple of weeks that the GFS, to some degree, has been very good at leading model trends. For instance, the models were showing a deep trough along the East Coast at the end of this week with a shot of cold, dry air, very cold, dry air coming in for Friday into Saturday. It backed off on that a few runs ago, and now the European has kind of done the same thing. But what the models have done is they have it coming in a different way. The cold air does get in here. The European is actually colder than the GFS for next weekend, but the GFS is cold enough. This is a big high coming down from the north. It's cold. It's more low-level cold air than it is aloft. So that in the depth of winter, when you're into later January and February, and you get a setup like that, it can have consequences with regards to snow and ice. When it's early in the season, it probably doesn't. But still, the GFS seems to be doing a better job at finding a trend. Now, when it comes to specifics, that may be a different story when we get into the short range. John Johnson, where is your money on the start to December? Do we continue this warm in the lower 48? Well, John, I think, well, let's just see what happens over the next couple of weeks. Now that we've flipped, I believe that major storm last week really sort of started the ball rolling in changing the overall pattern. Now, whether it lasts more than a week or two and goes back, I think there is some argument that it might, try to go back to more of a ridge in the east as we go into early December. But, sometimes when you're in pattern transitions like this, it takes those super long-range models a little while to play catch-up because persistence is built into a lot of that. The trend is your friend. So it may still be playing off on what the long-term trend was that set up back a month ago. So it might take another week before maybe the long-range models wind up showing something different. So I would just kind of be cautious about where we're going longer range with this. And the GEM is the Canadian. The RGEM model, which is the regional short-range Canadian model, actually does pretty well inside that 48-hour time frame. It did a very good job with the snowstorms last year. So I would say, the RGEM has a lot of value. I like to look at the RGEM quite a bit when we get into the winter months when we're dealing with specifics. Doug, can you just kind of clarify NATO, North NATO? I'm not sure what that stands for. So could you clarify that for me? And then maybe this way I could answer your question. Hate to use NATO as an analogy, but why not one global? Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, I got it. Well, everybody wants to come up with the model that's better than the other one. There was once upon a time, you just had access to the GFS and the European, and then once upon a time you didn't even have access to the European. Now, of course, we have hundreds of models and variations, and it does, I think, create forecast problems in the short range, more so than in the long range. Because, look, there isn't enough time in the day to look at anything. And I think at the end of the day, most people that, when weather is threatening, I think weather geeks tend to gravitate toward models that show the most dire solution, no matter what it is. It could be fairly clear on what's going to happen, but you always seem to find that one model that says, "Oh, this one's going to shows that things being far worse." I think that's one of the downsides of having all these models around, is that, even in the short range, there's a lot of inconsistency, and that makes for a lot of forecast difficulty for when you're trying to forecast for a very, very small area, and you've got all these short range models all doing different things. And then people forget to look at the radar, people forget to look out the window, and that is, at the end of the day, probably the most important thing you need to do when weather is really, playing out in your particular area. And Doug Crum, ratings. Well, I'll just tell you, I mean, I've never been told by anyone in my work experience that I need to, use or craft my forecast toward whatever model shows the most dire scenario. Okay. I think that the biggest fear that forecasters have is that they don't want to, get it wrong. So, they're trying to look at all the possibilities, and they're being very careful. But I don't think, none of the colleagues that I know of, I've never heard we've never had a conversation where we've said, okay, we need to do this because it shows a snowstorm and we need to drive ratings up. That just doesn't happen. How are the early sunsets without daylight saving? Well, Delvin, I like the fact that we're back to standard time, because, like I said, we get to see the models an hour earlier. So when snowstorms are a threat, I can stay up and stay reasonably awake for the European when it starts running at about 1:15. I'm not staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning like I am during daylight saving time. I wish they would just get rid of it. There's no practical purpose anymore to have that extra hour, that hour moved ahead. We should just go back on standard time and just stay there. But, that's me. Other people might disagree. I think one of the reasons why I was reading once not too long ago an article about one of the reasons why they don't get rid of daylight saving time, it's actually the retail industry is a great proponent of daylight saving, because the later sunsets allow for people apparently shop more when we have the later sunsets as opposed to the earlier ones. Go figure. Let's see. Yeah, you know what? I did see that, Delvin. There was some talk about getting all the New England states and taking them out of daylight time and moving them back to standard time. I'd love to see them do that, by the way. Since I'm on Long Island, which is just due south of Connecticut, I actually would have to just go, take a boat ride across Long Island Sound, and it would be an hour earlier there. Upper 30s for Friday and low around 20 South Central PA. You know what? I don't think it's impossible. TechMan 330. There is that cold air that's coming down for Friday, coming down for later Friday night, and through the next weekend. If not Friday night, certainly Saturday night. I think you're certainly going to see temperatures down in the low 20s and maybe even some teens in places not too far from you. But the air mass is certainly impressive enough on the models, all the models of what I looked at during today. Let's see. Yes, originally Profan Roach, it was originally set up for farmers because they needed to get out on the fields, and for harvesting, but and planting and harvesting. But that's kind of not really, a big deal anymore, since most farms are now, basically commercial farms and not family run. Most, not all. Let's see. You want the polar vortex, Pandaz. Well, you do and you don't. You want a polar vortex, but you don't want a polar vortex locked up in Canada where all the cold air gets locked away up in the Arctic and doesn't have an opportunity to come down. So polar vortexes, the whole concept of them, as if they just were invented and never occurred. You have to have them all in the right place, depending on your geography. So you don't. There's a lot of stuff in the weather world that is given way too much weight. I think the North Atlantic Oscillation, for example, the Greenland block. Yeah, it's great to have a Greenland block if you like snow in the east, but I got to tell you, again, from the standpoint of the specifics, we can get heavy snow without a block. We've seen that happen many times in the last 15, 16 years. So, and certainly before. So I'd rather focus on just what's in front of me rather than kind of, get into all these technical, long range factors that may or may not be there and may or may not have an impact. Rather, I just like to have it, to see what's in front of me and deal with that. Nathaniel, 5.7 earthquake in Trinidad. Whoa, they're starting to move the earth again. Alcina, too cold. Storms getting pushed down to our south. Well, if you have, very, very strong blocking, if you have very strong blocking in the North Atlantic, then yeah, that's when the southern part of the United States winds up getting big snowfalls, and a lot of times those storms don't make it up north of the southern Mid-Atlantic states. So you're quite right. That's why I rather deal with these things on an individual basis and just see how the whole season evolves and not get too wrapped up in all the other stuff that's going on with El Nino, La Nina, QBDs and QBOs and all these acronyms. EPO, East Pacific Oscillation, North Atlantic Oscillation, the Pacific North America pattern. I mean, I'm not saying any of those things aren't important. They are. But at the end of the day, you have to just kind of look at what's in front of you and see what's happening. I remember having arguments with people, with bigger snow events that we've had, and they would take stands against it because of the PNA and the EPO and the NAO and all the rest of it. In the meantime, you've got a 6 to 12 inch snowfall in front of you, and you can't understand why. Well, because you're not looking, and that's my big objection. Raymond, I know you're always looking for severe weather up in upstate New York. I don't think you're going to see it tomorrow, as the front should start to weaken as it comes east. Plus, there's a big marine layer that's kind of stuck here right now, and I think it's going to take an awful lot for that warm front to move on through. So I'm gonna say it's a bet against, in my opinion. You want one in February? Well, you know what? You got a long way to go. We're just in November. I think again, we watch how all of this sets up going forward, and that's really the most important thing here. I would certainly, the Northeast did very well last winter with snow. If you were north of 40 degrees north latitude, maybe 40 and a half degrees north, if you want to get really specific, northern New Jersey, from New York City and Long Island, but particularly once you got up into the Hudson Valley and then you went up through much of northern PA, on through upstate New York and New England, there was quite a bit of snow last winter. Away from some of the coastal areas didn't quite do as well, but still, overall, it was snowy, snowier than normal there. Everywhere else, south and west of there, got very little, but I think this year it may be a little different. I just sense that there is more of a normal looking atmosphere developing. Again, whether that means that you can have all the cold air in the world, if you don't have the storms around at the right place at the right time, you're not going to get your desired outcome. Some people don't want snow. Okay, let's make it clear. Some people don't want a cold and snowy winter. Some people want it warm and wet, or warm and anything. But snowstorms, because obviously they are debilitating and they can, horribly inconvenient, even though they do look pretty. Yes, David, I think you have a pretty good shot. You're going to get that cold air later this week. You might have some. I don't know exactly where you are, but it'll probably be cold enough. We're going to start chipping away more and more at areas that haven't had their first frosts and freezes yet. So I think that's going to be happening through much of this week after tomorrow, once we get this first cold front to move on through. Alicina, I hate it when people hype up forecasts like the one in March. It was a bust for Long Island. Meanwhile, actually hard for it to get a lot in coastal areas. You need the setup in March to be closer to perfect. It is difficult, but not impossible. It has happened. The storm you're referring to last March was literally a 20, not even a 15-mile margin of error in that with regards to the outcome, because you could have gotten in your car and driven into northern Nassau County, which got 8 or 9 inches out of that, and it was that that ice that a lot of folks had because we had sleet out here in a large area for hours and hours. And of course, once you got up into New York City, if you went into the Bronx, the North Bronx in particular, there was every bit of a foot on the ground. And then once you got into Westchester County and southern Westchester, there was a foot to a foot and a half. So it was a very, very tight line. And I don't, you can't get on forecasters for that. That was a major, snowstorm for the Northeast. And, somebody's going to, there's always going to be some place that gets burned. In every snow event, there's always somewhere in a forecaster's responsible area where someone is not going to wind up with what is predicted. That is just a given. So, you can't forecast for zip codes. You have to kind of do it in a general way, and it makes it very difficult. And there's always going to be somebody that's going to fall short as far as what you think amounts are going to be. All right, folks, that was a good chat we've had today. As we're 41 minutes into this, now 42. Thanks for staying around. I really appreciate it. We'll be live streaming this week, probably around our usual time during the week at 6 o'clock East, a little after 6 o'clock Eastern time. Wednesday, I may live stream earlier because of my library talk. I either may do it before or after, or perhaps if the weather's starting to look interesting for next weekend, who knows? You might get 2 live streams during the day. So thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. And of course, you can always check all the latest weather on meteorologistjoecioffi.com. And you can check out Angry Ben on nycweathernow.com. My Facebook page is Meteorologist Joe Cioffi. Angry Ben's is Angry Ben's Angry Weather, and you can check him out on that. I put the link up to the Joe Stradamus store. If you want to take a look, by all means, if you got a Christmas gift for somebody in mind who's a weather geek, there's plenty of stuff there for you to choose from. And thanks for those of you who hit Super Chat. I really appreciate that. Grime, the solar minimum knocking on our door. I've read a few articles about it. I'm not a close follower of that, but I'll tell you what I will do. I'll ask my colleague Joe Rayo, who's very big on astronomy, and ask him what he thinks of it. I think he probably would have a much better opinion on it than I do. So I'm going to ask him, and I'll try to remember to come back to it. Next time you're on, just remind me. All right, everybody have a great week, and we will talk to you on Monday.